organized, but we thought it would be great to put some light on for oncoming struggles and the things that are happening across the globe. I'll start by announcing the beginning of the academy and then going into a little bit of what is going to happen in the next few hours and then in the next 2 weeks. We are starting, when we were designing this academy, the idea was to bring the live cases and the things that really are considering important in the world of activism to the largest group of people possible. I see it's a very great group of people and I'm very happy because of it. So what is going to happen? We're going to put some light on the world before COVID today. So we're going to take a look at what really happened in 2019, which was impressive regarding the number of the nonviolent movements. We are going to have some thrilling hosts that I'm going to announce within a few minutes that will put some light on some really exciting struggles happening in 2019. We'll also put some lights on where these struggles are now and how the pandemic impacted these struggles. From there on, we move into the nowadays and a very different world and very different reality, which is the activism in the time of pandemic. This Friday, we are going to talk about how pandemic actually shrinked the space for civic sector and pro-democracy movements across the globe, but also how movements are ingeniously accommodating to this new situation, both in strategic and tactical terms. We will also have several really interesting guests. Next Tuesday, we are moving to the probably most vivid and most important battle of today, which is the racial equality struggle that happens across the United States. How this struggle impacts the world, what are the small victories, what are the turnouts, what it tells us about the world that we can expect after pandemic. Are these all protests and movements that have been put in a refrigerator during corona pandemic are just going to explode once the pandemic is over? We're going to have several thrilling guests from the movement. This will be hosted by Canvas chair Slobodjinovic. We'll end up putting a more light on what Canvas is particularly passionate about, which is the next Friday session, August 7, creative activism, dilemma actions, use of humor. We are finishing the very interesting research that will bring you into the world of strategic thinking of how to put your opponent in a dilemma situation, how it worked historically, what are the newest examples, and what our data show. So tune in for very interesting questions and very interesting guests. Here comes today, we are going to talk about the 2019 and what has changed. We're going to take a look at a very thrilling case studies that really shook the global arena last year. We're going to take a look at Bolivia with Janice Vacadaza, co-founder of Rios de Pie. We are going to talk to our friend Kumbu, coming from Matabele Land Institute in Zim. We are also going to have our star from Sudan, probably the brightest point of last year, Rania Aziz. The session is going to be interactive the most possible way with this number of people. So what is going to happen is that I strongly invite you to use chat. And as well as you're saying welcomes and sending us beautiful views from different places in the globe, you can use chat to ask questions, share opinions, and share resources. Our guests are going to look at the chat and try to answer the questions. I'm going to answer some questions in the chat while they are talking, and then we're going to collect some questions and going to direct it to our guests to answer them live when the time comes. Expect the first half of the presentation to be mostly us talking and you asking questions and we all chatting together. The second part of the class more interactive and more focused on your question. Hope this makes sense. Get ready and I hope you like speed because this is going to be pretty thrilling experience. And I like to say, I will say excuse me in forward if there are any technical hiccups with this because we never did it with such a large amount of people and I'm both thrilled and a little bit scared how it's going to work. Okay, so welcome to the last decade. Really bad days for bad guys, and it has been repeated overtly in the press that it has never been tougher being a dictator than in the last decade. And this was kind of the narrow field of interest for scholars and activists, but then the Arab Spring really changed it. And with 5 or 6 strongmen falling down within the range of months, the world really picked up the interest in nonviolent struggle and how nonviolent movements work. And yes, everybody was excited with the role of social media in this, and the world was really thrilled about, oh, now we have Facebook, we are going to be democracy in 5 to 10 years. The whole world is going to change. But as usually after the big party, what you can expect is a big hangover. And what really happened is a little bit different world. So looking at the world indexes of democracy, this one comes from Freedom in the World. This is the annual publication made by Freedom House that looks in the countries that are increasing or decreasing in terms of democracy. We are actually not doing very well. In the last 13 years, we see democracy decline across the globe. We see in the last years, less than 50 countries improving in terms of human rights and equality rights and democracy. We see around 70 countries annually decreasing on this thing. So democracy is losing, bad guys are winning. What in the world is happening? There can be 2 explanations for this. One really well explained in the book of our guest next Tuesday, William J. Dobson, called Dictator's Learning Curve, very dear to our hearts. Order it, read it. You will see how the authoritarians are adopting to the new reality and what measures they take in order to preserve status quo. Another very interesting phenomenon is that majority of democracy decline is not coming from authoritarian regimes. Majority of democracy decline in our last decade or so, 13 years, is coming from electoral democracies. So you can see the countries where you had democratically or semi-democratically elected presidents, places like Turkey, Philippines, Hungary, that are declining in democracy. Actually, the Carnegie study shows that 2/3 of democracy decline is coming from the countries that had strong or medium strong democracies. So the role of nonviolent movements when it comes to democracy and human rights seems to be preserving and defending democracy rather than being on the attack side of the things in the authoritarian systems. There are also several really good books on this matter, but beware, democracies die slowly. And Ronald Reagan wasn't really my favorite American president, but he had my favorite American president's quote when he says that democracy is always one generation far from the extinction. No democratic institutions will hold on if the people abandon it. And this is where we are witnessing the role of people power movements and civil rights organizations. Fast forward to last year, it was really amazing and thrilling. It started in the Middle East. The sun always rises in the East with the unexpected uprisings in places like Algeria and Sudan that were normally dormant during the times of the Arab Spring. Within the spread of months, the hundreds of thousands of people, more than 50% of them women, which is why Rania's case study is going to be so interesting, poured on the streets and get rid of long-standing strongmen. Where we are with this struggle, what Sudanese did well, how did they expected the coup and found a strategy to fight the coup, what Algerians didn't do well with the lack of the strategy. These are some things that we can discuss later in the topics. Fragile states, sectarian states, activists call them failed states, were also affected. Places like Iraq and Lebanon, places where you have an artificial stability, places where people are unsatisfied with the status of things, were also the arenas for large nonviolent movements. Of course, one of the most visible things that we were watching is a David versus Goliath struggle, the fight for more democracy and more autonomy in the Hong Kong. We have seen some ingenious tactics and large massive organizations. We also see how lack of nonviolent discipline can diminish numbers and create a space for your opponent to make a narrative and really divide people. Fast forward to Eastern Europe, even in the countries of European Union, even in the places that were considering to be still dormant like Russia, there were large, mostly anti-corruption movements. So is the corruption the soft belly of authoritarians? Is this the topic that makes everything personal and make normally dormant people mobilized? We're witnessing the weeks and months of historically massive protests in Romania. In numbers, these protests were bigger than the downfall of Ceausescu. We were witnessing Poles fighting against their illiberal government. We were witnessing Hungarians fighting against their illiberal government. So these are the two EU countries. Don't forget that pro-democracy struggles are not limited to the autocracies. Don't forget that human rights are regularly violated in the places that we consider stable democracies. And then normally dormant places like Russia also have witnessed their own portion of nonviolent protest, mostly by youth. Country that we consider the beacon of democracy also has its own uprising, starting from a Women's March with the largest single day of protest in the history of the United States, continuing with a very interesting wave of gun control protests where high school kids from Parkland, Florida actually did what we call the proper pillar targeting and taking a look in how they can exercise their power over companies instead of yelling in front of the city halls and state parliaments, have shown us that, that there is a whole new generation of creative activism worldwide. Anti-immigration policies also caused a large protest lately, but also throughout the 2019, we have seen the uprising in the struggle for racial equality and ending up the systemic racism, the struggle which is so large and so important that we're going to spend 2 hours talking about it next Tuesday. All of these struggles have things in common. They are looking at the different constituencies. They're obviously mobilizing the large numbers of the people, but as one of the first Canvas lessons will tell you, you don't see unity, you don't see vision, you don't see organization, and mobilization without the organization is a very fragile thing. In our research, in our history of working with different groups, we have seen large waves of the mobilization, but what clever movements did in the history was using this mobilization to boost their numbers, to train their people, and to carry on when the mobilization wave passed. I still have my personal feeling is that we still have yet to see this type of process before we call the series of protests in the United States movement. There are things which are distinguishing movement from the protest, but I'm just teasing you so you agree or disagree with me more in the chat, and please feel free to disagree. Later on, that people power is not only about democracy and human rights, it's also saving this planet for our kids, starting with large Amazon fires in places like Brazil and Bolivia, ending up and concluding with the 2 global movements, one called Fridays for Future, whose iconic face is young Greta Thunberg, one called Extinction Rebellion, which is the largest growing worldwide environmental movement. We have witnessed people power serving the idea that we need to do something about this planet and that time is now. These movements have shown the large numbers, these movements have shown the large international character, these movements have gathered the variety of organizations, they're influencing policies now. Whether or not they will be able to shape the course of the planet is yet another question, and specifically dear to the heart of the people who, like me, have young kids, because I really do care what I'm leaving to them, and I feel guilty that I'm not doing much, which is why we brought a really guest today who was helping protests against the government when the Amazon forest was burning in Bolivia. Shani Wakadaza is going to speak to you really soon. Last but not least important, when you take a look at the effectiveness of the nonviolent movements, very often you figure out that the great issues so dear to our activist hearts, things like racial, financial, gender, sexual orientation, equality, democracy, are not the real mobilizers of people. When you take a look at what really sparks these large protests, it's very often about the corruption, very often about the economy. Remember the protests in Sudan, the protests in Zim. It was all either price of bread or price of fuel or economic meltdown. Why it is so important for movements to have bread and butter issues? Because the bread and butter issues are the things that, that are making the process personal. So when you take a look at the movement and the organizations, they tend to have a gradual growth until the topic appears, which kind of affects everybody. So you want to look at the Georgia and Ukraine and Serbia, it is election fraud. You want to look at the Philippines, Lebanon, it was the case when the opposition leader was assassinated. You want to look at Zim, you want to look at Sudan, it's a price of bread. It's a price of fuel. It is somebody everybody feels on their own skin. So what is the rationale behind it? How are the movements playing when it comes to these things? And what are the main principles? We keep repeating that the movements are successful only if they can achieve vision and unity, only if they show planning. There are only two types of nonviolent movements in this world. They're either spontaneous or successful. So every success requires meticulous planning. What is the role of nonviolent discipline? Why are the nonviolent movements twice more likely to succeed if you read the serious scientific research like the one coming from Chenoweth and Stefan in their iconic book, How Civil Resistance Work? We're going to hear a lot about this and more, and this is the time for me to sit down and lead to Rania, who is going to talk a little bit about the most exciting case last year, the case of Sudan. First, kicking out the dictator, then preparing military to step in, then fighting the coup. Rania, please take the floor.
Hi. Yeah, am I on mute?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hello. It's a pleasure being really delighted to be here with you guys today, and happy to share my experience as well. So to start with, just to give a little bit of context background about our revolution in Sudan and what happened since the Bashir regime took power until date, I'm gonna take you quickly through the history of the revolution. It was 30 years of dictatorship, started in 1998, in 1989, sorry, and ended in April 2019. In this 30 years, there was a continuous resistance. There was no one single day without resistance. And that it took different shapes from peaceful resistance to armed resistance as well until December 2018. In December 2018, our story of Just Fall has started. It was ignited by a failed economy, and as Sergey said, students' bread protest. It started by a bread protest outside Khartoum in different states in December 2018. And then on the 25th of December, the protest started taking a very organized, different shape. The first call for the first organized protest in Khartoum took place the first call was by the SPA, the Sudanese Professional Association, and that was for the 25th of December, followed by another protest on the 31st of December. And then things started taking a very different shape from a random protest to a very organized setup where the SPA articulated our vision and our demands as a nation and released something called the Freedom and Change Declaration. The Freedom and Change Declaration is a declaration, it's our manifesto basically, it's a declaration to why do we want change and what our demands are. Following that declaration, we started forming something called the Forces of Freedom and Change, which is, it included most of the political parties and most of the civil society and movement. They all have signed this Freedom Declaration and formed the Forces of Freedom and Declaration. Fast forward, mobilization started, the formation of the resistance committees within different neighborhoods started to form, and professional strikes, and also professional parallel unions, and people started organizing themselves within institutions, public and private sector, and the street actions and demands were very clear. Fast forward, toppling the regime in April 2019. And from April 2019, we started for 2 months, we started the FFC started the negotiation with the Transitional Military Council then. And few months after, which is in July, with many negotiation sessions, we reached a power sharing deal with the TMC. It's a very long story. There are a lot of details. I'm just giving a background context. And then we signed the power sharing deal with the FFC and the Transitional Military Council in September 2019. The formation of the civilian-led government was announced. The current player and the current scene and what's happening in Sudan currently, there are many influential players in the political scene. The transitional government, with its two sides, the civilian and the military side as well, and the FFC being the political incubator for the government. The FFC, as I said, it's different political parties and civil society as well, and movements that are part of the FFC forces. And resistance committees, we still have the structure of the resistance committees in place. And they're moving from resistance committees to change committees, change agent committees. Also, there is important player, but a very weak player at the moment, which is the rebel groups and the armed movement. There is ongoing negotiation. Peace is the #1 priority in the transitional government. These are the main players in the scene now. We are faced with many challenges. I mean, I wish we were given a manual for what after the revolution. We are currently faced with many challenges, of which the most important ones are the economic challenges and dismantling the deep state and the civil service reforms, which is related to institutional building, and the security sector reforms. Because it's been 30 years of dictatorship and security forces are completely brutal and abiding by the previous government laws. So these are the main challenges currently. The street demands are also very clear because we still have the ownership of the revolution is owned by the people still, and we still have the structure of, not the revolution euphoria only, but the structure of our resistance structure and our resistance tools are still in place. On the 30th of June, a few weeks back, there were a big marches and big protests around the country. We're asking for very clear demands. All have to do with reforms. Structural reforms, appointing the civilian governors was one of the demands, and also establishing the parliament as well. So moving from our demands, just to give a brief about what I do and my what I belong to and what the organizations I belong to do. I'm currently part of something called MENSA, which is the Sudanese Women in Civic and Political Groups. It's the largest women coalition and is also part of the FFC. This body is working, we're working on many things, but mainly our main focus is working for the new Sudan, where peace, democracy, and justice prevails, and also where people can enjoy equal rights and citizenship as well, good governance and accountability. I'm also part of the human resources body within the Sudanese Professional Association, and what we work on mainly and what our focus is now is to support the civil service reforms and the institutional building within the transitional government. These pictures are just to take you through the history of how the revolution was like and the number of people turned out and how people took to the street, fearless, and on the left side down here is the civilian government and all the ministers. Okay. the most important activities we are doing currently, and the most important tactics, and how do we keep the momentum, and how are we keeping the street actions going on, and how are we keeping our demands heard, and the relationship between us on the civil society side and on the street sides and the government are many. On the government actions versus the street demands and reforms and the needed reforms, we use different tools and different tactics and different course of actions. We are still using the online campaigns and the offline campaigns, organizing peaceful protests and demonstration. There are many protests going on still. Whenever we use any channel of communication or the resistance tool that we know, and we need to communicate with the government, and we need to voice our street demands, we either organize peaceful protests or statements or press conferences. We have an open channels when we can go to the Prime Minister's office and write a statement and submit it to the Prime Minister and his office. So there are actions still going on. The ownership of the revolution is still there. The street voices are still very loud and still heard. Using these tactics and making sure that this structure is still ongoing, and this kind of communication is not dying out. Another example I would like to share, which is close to my heart and to what I do now, which is the women empowerment and participation in the government and the street councils. It was a women-led revolution. However, the women participation in politics and in the political scene in Sudan, it's not as strong as it should be. The Revolutionary Act was very strong, women participation was very high, but in the political and leadership positions, it's always a very male-dominated sphere. What we do in the women groups, we use different tactics and tools to ensure that we are advocating for our causes. We use the public statements, we've written open letters to the Prime Minister, we organize peaceful marches, we do public talks, and we do also advocacy with like-minded political parties to push for our agenda as well. And another thing we did, which was very proactive, is we have mapped all the active community leaders, women leaders across the country and in conflict areas and IDP camps as well. And we have prepared their profiles to support their campaigns and to push these profiles forward when the parliament is in this information or when the selection for the parliament take place. So we are working on our advocacy plans and on our street actions as well. Yeah, as we said, it was clearly a women-led revolution. However, we're still protesting for our rights. And the fight against the patriarchy and the political system, the male-dominated political system in Sudan, is not a fight over power, it's a fight for civil rights and a fight for equality as well. Okay. And yeah, this takes us to what is the effect of our activities and the work we do in terms of media and in terms of mobilization and response. In terms of media, it's a very different era now with the transitional government and with the new Sudan. Freedom of speech is giving us a space to voice our concerns and our demands in different platforms, in official platforms, on TV, on newspaper, and interviews. So there are many press conferences, and the media agencies are very collaborating, and media advocacy campaigns are very fruitful, and we are using this tool widely, and it's supporting our causes. On the mobilization, because there is active public participation, numbers are increasing, and people are getting much more organized and getting much more focused on the kind of work they want to do and the results they want to see. We came from a very zoom out big picture to a zoom in and focus groups and demand-based groups as well. And there are because we haven't had unions in the past, it was mainly unions, very much NCP, National Conference Party, the previous ruling party. We started forming now our steering committees, our union steering committees, as well as the union's laws are in review currently, and very soon we're going to have a union's law that will allow us to start forming our unions. The response to the actions we've been doing and the tactics we are still using is very positive. For example, I mentioned in slides back that we have had a very clear demands on the 30th of June when we took to the streets with a statement to the prime ministers asking for specific reforms and specific changes. 2 days after that, the prime minister had a press conference where he promised that he will respond to the demands he had received. And based on that, he announced a cabinet reshuffle a few days after that, where 7 ministers had left the cabinet, and now they are in the phase of recruiting new ministers. Also, one of the demands was to appoint governors, civilian governors, and that was announced yesterday. We have civilian governors in all the states, of which 2 are women. And we also, one of the demands was to move the peace talks forward to reach a peace agreement, and this is also going on track. So the results of the tactic that different groups and different movements are using is paying off, and there is a channel for change. Cool. And what are the challenges and what's next? What's coming next? One of the biggest challenges we're faced with is the economy situation. And what are the government measures dealing with the economy situation, and what kind of reforms are in place? What we are demanding currently, we are demanding clarity from the government side on whether are they going to lift subsidies, what are the scenario, and what is the new budget. We don't have this access to information yet. The government have not made it clear on what reforms and measures they are putting in place. So, and it's a big challenge because it's not only the transitional government, it's not only dismantling the deep state and the economic empire the previous regime had, is also the incubation, the government incubator, which is the FFC, and the alignment between the FFC and the government and the transitional government. For example, the finance minister have had his remedies and he had his plan for economic reforms that the FFC objected to. So we need some clarity. We need some clear reforms and plans to be communicated to us, to the people. The second very urgent and needed challenge that we're faced with, and that's one of the things we need to focus on very soon, which is the urgent need for structural reforms within the FFC itself. The current setup of the FFC is delaying the government and preventing the government from moving forward because the cabinet cannot take executive decisions without getting back to the FFC. So this current structure of the FFC needs some sort of relationship management, as well as it's been 30 years of the previous regime doing nothing but weakening the relationship of these political parties, and not only weakening the relationships together, but not giving them space to work together as well. So there are there are some sort of reforms needs to take place within the FFC to move from opposition parties to leadership and do some internal structural changes as well. As well as civil society role. The civil society are part of the FFC now, and that also needs some sort of reforms. This is one of the things we need to look into. The last thing I would want to talk about is the women participation in decision making and all aspects of change. We need, what's coming next is we need to push for more inclusion and more adherence to the constitutional document. We need to push for women participation in peace talks. These are the hot things that we need to look at currently. And these are the challenges we're faced with after the revolution and trying to find our way in the transiting from authoritarian regime to steps toward democracy. So, and the revolution continues.
Thank you, Rania. I'm always impressed with the change you made in Sudan. I can see that there's a lot of questions for you later on coming from the chat. But I will leave floor now to Kumbu from Zimbabwe. He's really like impressive and creative guy, so I'm sure you will love his presentation. Kumbu, please go ahead, take the floor. It's yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I will I will start sharing a little bit about the movement that we're working on, which is called Beta Bulawayo. Generally, maybe I will start by giving a brief on Beta Bulawayo. Did it start and what to achieve? Maybe start by the statement that I love, which says, change individuals, change the world. I will not explain that statement because I know it always brings a lot of, in terms of what really does it mean. But if we look at, in terms of Zimbabwe, what the current situation, that's really happening. I think we all know that Zimbabwe is facing a crippling economic and leadership crisis, with over 70% of the population unemployed, especially the young people, because we have a very youthful population in the country, which exceeds 55% of the total population of the country. And therefore they are unemployed and their future is really bleak because of the leadership crisis that is pertaining. We also have the issue of poor service delivery, then pertaining because of the dual process of leadership and economic crisis. Issues of access to education, health, access to clean and safe potable water are a major challenge. Then also we have a problem of an agitated but scared citizenry. The citizenry is agitated, the citizenry is concerned about what is happening, but it's scared to take any action because of the militarized state and the history that of brutalization of protesters in the country. Also, we have had a history of violent protests, the most violent being in January 2019, which was sparked by increase in fuel prices, and there was a lot of burning and looting of shops, public infrastructure. We also have a happening university education. Our universities are dulling degrees, like 30 people are graduating and young people looking to access tertiary education. And also there is this scenario pertaining of lack of a unified citizenry in terms of social movements, and political players are not unified around the common challenges that they face. And of course, our major players in the country will really put the major players in terms of what's happening. We have a union of the government, the military, police, and the ruling ZANU-PF. We have a fragmented opposition, and also civic society efforts are fragmented. We have also an sporadic and uncoordinated movement. We have seen social movements coming up. Most of them are cause movements with a small cause come up 1 year, they go, you don't see them again. 6 months, they try to make an impact, they are no longer there again. And also scared, apologetic, but losing business community. They are scared to stand up, but they are losing a lot of business opportunities because of the situation that. Then what have we been doing? I will talk about the movement that I'm part of, Beta Bulawayo. We are in the second largest city of the country. Bulawayo is the second largest city in the country, which is a de facto capital of the Matabeleland region of the country. And this city is actually having a lot of water problems of late. But it didn't start now because we're in a region which has very low rainfall patterns. But because of issue of centralization of power, which due to lack of implementation of the constitutional provisions on devolution and other causes, the city has been having declining service delivery. That's why then in 2020 we formed Bulawayo as a movement that, what does it seek to do? We want to seek a better city. With better service delivery and a more responsive leadership. So our main vision really is an inclusive, safe, better, and enjoyable city. We want to enjoy staying in this city, which we love. And so what has been our main goal has been to then say, how do we enjoy being in this city? How do we have a better city? Is having a goal which is dual, where we are targeting the citizenry so that it's more active, it's more collective, it's more unified, and speaks in one voice, but also having a more responsive leadership. So what have we been doing as Beta Bulawayo? We have been mainly engaging in low risk, but high impact and scalable activities, where we are looking at activities that are low political risk, but activities that achieve impact, but also activities that can be scaled and actions that can be done by anyone, everyone in any part of the country. You can also take up and do these actions. So maybe key has been awareness and education on violence. We have been meeting, holding awareness sessions. We call them non-violent power talks, where we talk to citizens about the whole concept of non-violence actions, collective actions, organized actions, and what can we do, but also doing some symbolic actions, which I'm going to explain very soon. So I'll start by this one. We had a problem in 2019 of potholes. Because with too much rains, the roads were not attended. Most of them are old, dilapidated, and they need maintenance. So we then discovered that we're having a lot of potholes in the city, but the local authority was not attending to any of these potholes. They were taking time to act. Then we started planting grass on the potholes. With us, it was not a protest. When we were being asked by the security, when we were being asked by the local authority and other people, we said, no, we are not protesting. We are showing other motorists where there is a pothole. Because the problem with a pothole is that if you hit it, you can actually cause an accident. And when it's rainy, you can't tell that there is a pothole because of the water that covers. So you can easily hit the pothole. So I said, no, the grass then shows other motorists, other people that, no, there is a pothole there, be careful. We are being responsible citizens in a way. We did this, the few people started this in the morning, but in the evening, we're getting pictures of people planting grass also and shrubs in other parts of the city. So other people were picking it up. And what was the outcome? In 4 days' time, as you can see from the pictures. The local authorities started patching those potholes where we were planted. And so we're asking ourselves, oh, so they were saying they don't have money. They actually, where did they get the money? So it was an issue of just not being proactive and being responsive on time. We also had, as I spoke about, the issue of access to water being the key issue that we are actually seized with right now. For the first time, we are having water shedding for 144 hours a week without water. Some communities in the city have not been having water for the past, for more than 3 months. So what we have been doing as a movement, we started monitoring water pest, because the city has too many pests, water that is pest, the pipes were pesting, and then water is just flowing. And then we gave these pests what we call pest certificate. Every child who is born is given a birth certificate. So what we're then doing, we're giving these pest certificates to say, when did it pest, how much water is coming out, and the like. What was the response? In less than a week, all the places where we put pest certificate were actually fixed by the local authority. The first of them was that we gave a pest certificate in the morning, in the evening it was fixed. Then, of course, there was the issue of more funeral coffins because of the issue of 11 people. It have died now in Luveve because of contaminated water. When this was done, 3 people had died, and then we put 3 coffins, them in front of the office. And what has been the effect? Some people have been taking up actions. We are seeing more sporadic non-violent actions by other residents, more coverage by the mainstream media of non-violent protests. And also we are seeing membership is increasing and the responsible leadership. Then where are we going? What are the outcomes? I've spoken about them. Where are we going? I'll talk about my favorite, COVID-19. COVID-19 looks like a challenge. It has been a challenge to many. It is a challenge in terms of organizing, in terms of engaging, in terms of engaging even our leadership. But we have said, no, this is not going to be a challenge. It's going to be an opportunity. People don't care how much we know. They want to know how much we care. So we are standing with them during this time through a social movement that is called Against COVID-19. So what we are doing is now we are busy raising awareness and consciousness to young people on key things like physical distancing. We don't want to call it social distancing because we need to be socially close to each other through social media. Physical distancing, wearing of face masks, sanitizing. So we are producing videos, we are producing online material, which we are sharing on WhatsApp mainly, and we are also looking at taking it to the streets through actions that are not COVID risk. So I think that's the main challenge, and that's the main and we are going. I'll be here for now. Hope it makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kungu. This was very, very fast and impressive. I really enjoy every time when I listen about all the ideas and creative activism you guys do. So just keep up the good work. I will leave floor now to one amazing lady coming from Bolivia. She's interested in environment, but also is doing other interesting things. So Janice, I'm leaving floor to you now.
Thank you so much. I will proceed to share my screen. I don't know if you can see it. Hi to everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here. I've been reading the chat and it's wonderful to read so many environmental activists joining. My name is Janice. I'm from Bolivia. I'm part of a movement called Ríos de Pie, which means standing rivers. And I'm hoping in sharing some of our story, this can help you think of more ideas for you to also take on the powers that might be challenging your vision of tomorrow. So in regards of Bolivia, what is the current situation and their most important elements? I wanted to go back a little bit to kind of check what has happened in my country. During the past decade, we've seen an erosion of democracy and human rights violations to any leaders from civil society that presented a threat to the former government. Needless to say, that is in a way also happening today. And one of the things that were most worrisome for us was that indigenous protests, environmental protests, and any sort of protest that presented some sort of real leadership on the street were quickly crashed by the government of then President Evo Morales. And also you could see on a legislative way how democracy was also being weakened, because we had things where, for example, we had a referendum. The results of that referendum said that we didn't want indefinite re-election. We wanted a president to be able to be president only twice in a row. And although we said that on the referendum, the government decided to still change the law in our constitution and make it possible for any authority, not just the president, but also in other levels, to be able to re-elect themselves to continue being authorities essentially forever. So there were many things that were worrying us, and there were many protests. That's why we started Standing Rivers. Local authorities are also very corrupt in Bolivia, which is something that is not really that known in the international community. And they were not always of the same party, but the weakness of our institutions allowed that to happen. And there was absolutely no response, no positive response, especially to environmental issues when there were protests about it. Instead, there was a lot of persecution of environmental leaders. So this kind of hit a very high point when we reached the 2019 Amazon fires. A lot of people know about what happened in Brazil. Very few people know that the fires also happened in Bolivia. And this was sort of a response to legislation, since last year it was made legal to, quote, use controlled fires to expand agro-cattle industry. Those fires obviously were not controlled, they got out of control, and we didn't have the capacity to respond to them quickly. And environmental groups and civil society, we activated ourselves to go to the areas. We were heavily persecuted by the government because since we were on an electoral season, they didn't want the country to know how bad these fires were, because that meant that the elections had to be suspended and that the budget should be sent to the areas that were affected. However, there was absolutely no proper response from the government. We lost over 5 million hectares of forest, so you get an idea. I think that's twice the size of Switzerland. Firefighters died because they didn't have the proper protective equipment. One of those was actually the younger brother of a member of our movement. And many of us suffered heavy persecution just because we informed the international community about this, because we needed help. Like, the government was definitely not able to respond properly. And although all of this happened, the government never responded properly, like I said. And then we had the elections like within the same month. This was October last year. The fires crisis began at early August. And when we had the elections, not only were we already grieving because of everything that we had lost, over 2 million animals died during those fires in Bolivia last year, but then there was also a heavy electoral fraud that was seen by Bolivians with our own eyes. We lived through it. Those of us that were trying to do electoral control were like surprised by the amount of fraud that was very like, it seemed like as the government wasn't even trying to pretend that these were fair elections. So there were heavy protests for 21 days nationally. It was a campaign of civil disobedience that, contrary to popular opinion, I really would like to highlight that was very decentralized, although there were some faces that were very popular on the media at that time. Those who know Bolivians, and I think Latin Americans in general, would know that it's impossible for a country to obey to one single person. We are very stubborn and not very organized. So this was very strong protest. And then after that, the elections got suspended. There was a transitional government that came into power, who is also very not the best government that we could have. And in theory, the election should have been held in May this year. But given that COVID arrived to the country and we are going through a huge crisis thanks to COVID, the elections have been postponed twice already. And our institutions, as I mentioned, are pretty weak. And this goes beyond which party is in power. I think friends from Africa and other parts of Latin America can understand this. So it's even difficult for people to obey institutions themselves, because there's very little control and there's a lot of corruption. So what is happening has been very worrying. The most important players to understand Bolivia right now are, for example, the transitional government, which is split in two. The executive is controlled by old opposition parties that have very little understanding of reality on the streets for Bolivia. And then the legislative branch is controlled by the previous party of the mass, so the previous government, to say it that way. And there's a lot of counter decisions that are being made by both governments. So the citizenry is very confused as to what is the right way to go. And you can imagine how horrible that is during the COVID pandemic. The electoral branch is meant to be independent. We're still, I mean, I leave to you to judge if it's truly independent. The elections are going to be held in theory now in October the 18th, and there's 8 opposition parties. Most of them are recycled elites. I dare to say that there's no new leadership within the parties that are running, neither for the old government or the current opposition, if you want to call it that way. But what is strong, and it's still standing, and I really hope that those of you who are interested in Bolivia can understand this part, is that regardless of which party is in government, the agro industry, so the industry, agropecuaria, as we say in Spanish, the ones that raise cattle to sell it, are the ones that really hold a lot of power, especially the economical power. I would call them the Wall Street of Bolivia. And they were allied to the previous government, which was very difficult for people to understand because the previous government, in theory, protected the environment and indigenous rights, but in reality, they were so in like doing all of these things that really supported the business elites and the expansion of agro-cattle territory. And this also meant for setting our forests on fires legally. And then they are now allied to the current government. So this is a threat that environmental activists and human rights activists like myself are still facing. And civil society, this is a positive change, is very active in Bolivia. People were very scared to speak 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but now it's very active. However, it's dispersed and it's unorganized. So we can't say that there's like a union of civil activists. Where do we play a role in this? We are Standing Rivers. Youth Nonviolent movement we started 2 years ago. I'm surprised at how quickly we've grown. And we truly, what we want is a free, fair and safe Bolivia that respects indigenous rights, that respects environmental sustainability policies, because Bolivia might be small in your warm-up, but we hold so much richness in terms of biodiversity. And somehow doing our activism, because we started with the idea of doing nonviolent and creative protests, different protests that were not dangerous for people participating, we have also realized that sometimes it's better to provide help than protesting. It's an even better way to do activism. So whenever Bolivia has faced crisis, as in last year, our environmental crisis with the fires, and this year's during COVID crisis, we sort of stop all street protests and we go full on mode of like humanitarian relief, bringing help to those in need and trying to do our best so that through this experience as well, we get to understand different parts of Bolivia and the different obstacles they face, because we truly believe that being as we are a movement of young people, we still have a lot to learn from old leaders in Bolivia, and not just leaders in political roles or that have led civil society entities, but just like Bolivians ourselves. We are such a varied country. There are so many indigenous groups, some of them that are not even recognized by the current constitution. And then there's also so many different parts of Bolivia because we are in the middle of South America. So even geographically, it's such so many different environments to live in that we truly want to understand what is the vision of tomorrow for all of Bolivians. And we understand too that a movement has to grow and has to change and has to listen. So it's not like we think we hold the answer to everything or we know what the truth is. This protest is one of my favorite protests we've ever done. After the Amazon fires happened and then the elections happened and the fraud was proven by ourselves, by Bolivian citizens, we were very desperate because life was trying to continue as normal. What you see is a group of us sitting outside of a bank that had huge corruption cases in alliance with the government. And we wanted the different institutions to obey that the citizens had called on civil disobedience and for all institutions to close. However, this bank was not closing, as were many institutions allied to the government. And we decided to do a sit-in outside of this bank. We were using the face masks, barbijos, because we needed a lot of these items. I know we're using them for COVID right now, but when the forest fires were happening, we couldn't breathe because there was so many contamination of smoke in the air. So that was already a symbol of resistance to us because the government was denying that the fires were even happening. And this small protest, as simple as it was disobedience, but on a social level, because you're not breaking any laws by sitting on a public space. We managed to shut down the bank within an hour, just because they got scared that there was a protest going on outside, even though it was a silent protest. And this really hit the news. It was very popular because, as you see, there weren't many of us. But just the intention and the idea of doing this peacefully and silently was so different that a lot of people found it useful, and then it started happening on its own in different parts of the country. What are the most important activities we've been doing? I would like to highlight two, although we've been doing a lot. One of them is we've tried to create dialogue, because Bolivia is going through a very difficult transitional phase. The society is very divided. And one of those things has been creating the Domo Nacional, an event where we try to bring different groups of people so that they could say what they wanted to see change. We didn't let any political parties to participate in this, but we did invite indigenous leaders so they could tell us what is the best way to approach indigenous rights. They're already recognized in our constitution, but they're not applied. So we wanted to see how they thought this could be changed, not only on a legislative level, but also in a practical level. We invited LGBT groups, we invited different kinds of teachers from teachers unions, we invited doctors from doctors unions, which was an incredibly useful experience, because once COVID arrived to Bolivia, we already knew what their weaknesses were and what help they needed, because they had said it there. And we tried to create a space for dialogue, is essentially what I'm saying. And in terms of environmental change, we are continuing protests to demand change to the laws that make fires legal, because obviously in a country that is not the richest country in South America, to say it on a nice way, that has no quick response to huge fires, this law should have already been canceled, especially if we're in the middle of a pandemic. And knowing that right now we don't want to bring people to the street to protest because of the COVID crisis, we tried to be very creative and do different types of protests, and I wanted to show you these pictures. This was done on July the 9th, so it was about 2 weeks ago, I believe. We projected images of last year's fires on the Ministry of Environment and Health, which is the one you see on your right, Ministerio de Agua y Medio Ambiente. We projected it on the institution that is the one that authorizes the uses of fires, the ABT and INRA, which is a picture you can see on your right. And we didn't need to bring people on the street. This was done overnight, and it really hit the news. It was on every big newspaper. So we're trying to figure out what are creative persuasion tactics that we can do through dispersion. In terms of what has been the effect of our activities like the one I just mentioned have been covered by major newspapers. We've landed interviews on primetime shows that show at night, which is huge. This would have never happened to us a year ago. In terms of numbers and recruitment, we are in many of the main cities of Bolivia, and finally, we're also doing a lot of work in rural communities, which is also very important for us. We want to understand, like I said, the different challenges that we face, and we have people that are from rural communities. So working on COVID relief, bringing help to hospitals in different parts of the country that are not cities has been a great way also to understand everything that has to do with why those places are not being attended as they should. And then in terms of responses, on social media wise, we've had responses from former President Morales. He complained about me once on social media. The current government has also complained about us more than once, but what's even more important, we've gotten a lot of people to react to the fact that the fires were not a crisis that only happened last year. They are already beginning this year. This week, we've had to organize to help firefighters in Otuquis, which is the border with Brazil. So it's important to understand that for us at this point, it's more important to raise, to create action within civil society more than what we get in terms of mean tweets or something like that from authorities. And what's coming into the future, we're gonna continue relief work in terms of COVID. We think it's really important to help those in need. It could easily be one of us. So we're working as a team to protect and to help people. We will do vote monitoring during the elections as well, and we will also denounce to the international community and to the national community if we find any irregularities during the voting process, because everything that happened last year, the protests, were not to put a person in power. They were because we deserve to have free and fair elections like every citizen in the world should. So these elections are pretty much why we did everything we did, so we hope that we can have them. Environmentally wise, there are many legislations that need to change. We're going to continue doing protests. And then we're also trying to push for further inclusion of the LGBT community, because a lot of the pro-democracy movement currently in Bolivia is very old school, older generations, and they don't understand that a new vision of Bolivia has to include everyone. And this includes the LGBT community and other communities that sometimes they don't agree with because of lack of education mainly. And I wanted to end with this beautiful image, although it is a bit painful, where you can see that there was a lot of land that was lost last year during the fires. But there is that one green tree in the middle of everything that survived it and that continues to thrive. And we will continue to try and help that green tree so that we make sure that no matter how bad things look, we keep hope about everything. That's it for me.
Thank you, Janice. This was amazing. First of all, thank you all for these inspiring cases, and I was sure that it will be great, but wasn't sure how people will react. You can see by the bulk of questions that most of them are directed to you, which makes me very happy. This is where we go to the questions from the audience, and I'm very grateful for many questions. I'm also very grateful that some of you guys ended up answering some of these questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to direct a question or two to each one of our panelists, and then they will gradually answer it. What I will ask them to do is when their time comes to repeat the question. So we make sure that it hasn't been lost in the translation. I'll be starting with Rania. There were several questions about this shift from revolutionary movement to transition movement. How this affects your organization? What is the difference? What are the main obstacles? Maybe oppression is not there, but are people losing steam? So this explain a little bit these challenges of post-revolution, because the people are very keen to hear it. Also, another question was about the temporary occupied territories. And I know that in Sudan, you have many breakaway groups and many armed movements. So how the nonviolent movement deals with these pockets of violent resistance? Do you embrace them? How do you pacify them? How do you keep them controlled if you want? How do you deal with these? So I'll start with Rania and then continue with questions to other panelists. So Rania, floor is yours again. Reza, you can unmute her.
Okay, cool. For the first question on what are the obstacles and how did we change from pre-revolution to post-revolution, and what work and tactics we're using now. It's different if I'm just going to reflect on my movement or in general. It's in both scenarios is different. We have mastered the resistance tools. We've been working on trying to topple a regime. Moving from there to collaborating with a regime that we have brought into power is very different. It's very different, and it required us to change our ways of doing things. We are part of, we want this government to success. We are part of this change. At the same time, we do have our reservations and we do have our takes against how things are being done. There are different voices and different opinions on what is the best tactics, or what is the best scenario, or what is best for the government to do now to listen to our demands as well. So there are obstacles in this transition as well. Not only the government is faced by this, we as movements and civil society and resistant committees as well are faced with this transition and this need to shift from resistance to nation building and collaboration as well. What are we doing? We're learning, and we are learning very fast because it's a very dynamic time and things are happening very fast, and we are not responsive. We're taking proactive approach and trying not to fall into a same mistake that we've done months ago. So we are learning, and we're doing pretty well with this. The second question, I hope I answered. I hope I got the full question and I answered it all. I did, Serge? Did I miss any part of the question? No. The second question about the rebel groups and the armed movements. There is ongoing track of peace building track at the moment, and it's the #1 priority in the freedom and change, the second priority and the second demand in the freedom and change declaration, and it's the #1 priority in the transitional government. Most of these armed movements, they were rebels or armed movement for a reason, but now since the previous regime is not there and there is no civil war, we need to bring them to the peace table, to the peace building negotiation table, which is the case currently, and there are ongoing talks and negotiation regarding peace. And they're going to be part of the power, by the way. They do have seats in the parliament, reserved seat in the cabinet. They're going to be part of building the new Sudan.
Thank you, Rania. It's really interesting, and it's a set of challenges that we also experience here in Serbia and elsewhere, moving from revolution to transition. It is also one additional thing that tackles these movements in this phase, which is losing numbers. So it's always easy to be against the brutal government that shoots at you or throw tear gas at you. And it's far more difficult to, or less sexy if you want to mobilize the people on the topics like creating the ombudsman and, you know, transparency in public buying and all of this kind of stuff. So yes, lose of steam, and how do you turn this movement and this organization? And whether the movements should participate in this like they do in Sudan, I strongly suggest they should, or they should stay away like they did in Ukraine 2003, and then they did in Egypt again in 2011, and leave the transition to other players, and then find themselves completely sidelined and on the streets again within the few years. So this is really interesting period, and I think that looking more into transition and how do you achieve successful transition, and how do you follow up successful pro-democracy change with a durable democracy and building strong institutions is actually the really interesting field to work. Kumbu, everybody was happy with your humorous pranks, and you know, I'm a very strong advocate of dilemma actions and humor. And also to remind everyone on the panel and also everyone in the audience that we'll have a separate session on this coming next Friday, August 7th. But the question is, when you use these jokes, when you prank authorities, how this affects people? Do people feel more engaged? Does it break fear? Does it break apathy? Does it make people more, does it make your organization look silly and not serious? And also how it affects your opponent. Is it kind of putting them between the rock and a hard place? And how you avoid actually making them too pissed off to concede? So also when you look at the humor, is this always a universal thing? And how do you measure this not to backfire on you?
Thank you very much for that question. I think our idea of trying to use humor was so that we don't unnecessarily antagonize the local authority, but to show that we are also concerned about service delivery in our city. People are very much agitated. People are stressed. And if you look at the service delivery, the state of service delivery is stressful. And when you go to community halls where these discussions are happening, people end up insulting each other. They end up threatening each other and threatening the local authority officials. So, you know, when we use humor so that let's laugh about it a little bit, but it's still something that is very important. It's still something that is very dear. And what has been the impact? I think more and more we have gotten from the residents. They've identified with us. The residents have taken it seriously, and they always, when we look at the comments in the WhatsApp groups, the comments that come sometimes even to our email, to our phone numbers, is that this is very great. This is creative. We are tired of fighting. We are tired of throwing stones to each other. And this is good work. This is good engagement. To the local authorities, we have gotten mixed reactions. Some don't take it seriously. But I think with the time, they've realized, especially some officials, that when we start, we don't stop. We will start with the humor. If you don't respond, we will upscale it up. So then they then take it seriously, because this is also, it's something that people laugh about, something that enjoy, and then they spread, and then it becomes like bad publicity for them. And they don't want bad publicity for now, so they will want to act. So, but of course, we have heard some sentiments that some are saying we are just trying to make a mockery. This is not, of course, there are also some activists that are saying, no, this is not serious. We need serious engagement. But we think it's also serious engagement because it has borne a lot of serious fruits. So it's also an issue of a balancing act. Let me just say, when we are planning an action, it normally takes us close to 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes we can do it overnight or over 2 days, but I will tell you, if we do it overnight or over 2 days, we will not have slept for close to 2 nights, where we are busy debating and we'll be phoning each other midnight to say, no, but let's change there, let's do it this way. You know, there is this back and forth, we criticize it ourselves, and then eventually we then say, no, but we think now we have come up with a better strategy. When we started with planting trees, we wanted to plant big, big shrubs. And some members said, no, they will say you are damaging cars, you will do this. So we will then we're thinking about it so that eventually you come up with something better. I think I hope I have answered and elucidated on that. Thank you.
I think it's a really good answer and a really good prelude for our session next Friday. Remember, we are all fans of creativity and humor, because as you could see in Kumbu's example, it really works well. It puts a good name on the movement. It adds the cool factor to the movement. But people love things which are funny. They love to participate in the things which make them feel good instead of making them feel angry and things of that kind. And it also as you will see in our study, it has a tremendous impact on replicability. Creative, humorous actions inspire other people to do creative, humorous actions. This is a really interesting phenomenon. And if you tune in next Friday, our friend Sofia, who was leading this research, will show you the exact figures, where I think more than 2/3 of successful humorous actions produce the replicas. And of course, imitation is always the sign of the recognition. And then, of course, it works good in breaking the fear. Kumbu, you are too modest. You're operating in one of the narrowest and most oppressive environment. Out of all people in the panel, it can be compared only to the Bashir Sudan in this case. And thank you for doing this, and thank you for sharing this amazing spirit. I will end up with a question for my friend Janice. I was thinking whether I should respond to it, but it's always good to hear it from somebody who is doing it every day. And the question was unrelated to Bolivia. It was actually related to Fridays for Future and how they become kind of dependent on Greta Thunberg and her image and her leadership. And what happens with this kind of stuff? So do movements really need charismatic leaders? Is it good for movements? Is it bad for movements? What happens when they screw up? What happens when they get killed? What happens when they get expelled? What happens when they get under pressure? And how you balance this need to lead the movement with the also need for making more people participating and not being jealous on whoever is the leader. And I know you had many debates in Standing Rivers about it. So I decided to send you a non-Bolivian question, like the more generic question.
Perfect. Thank you, Sergio. I think it's good to be humble and recognize our mistakes. And as Standing Rivers, I think a big mistake we made was not decentralizing leadership early enough. And that had a high cost for the public faces of the movement. And when things got really, really rough, by that I ask you to please understand that the context during the Amazon fires, it may not sound like a horrible experience for humans themselves, but I cannot explain how horrible it was, because we were trying to get help. And those of us that spoke publicly were heavily persecuted by the government by asking for that. In my case, I had to move out of my parents' house to protect them, and I have been living in friends' houses ever since. So please, please, please do take my advice. It is good to have leaders that are charismatic and that bring hope to people. But the trade-off is that whoever is the face of a movement becomes an easy target for the government, clear target for whoever your opponent is. In our case, it was the government. And you are also running the risk of making them face very difficult moments that might affect their mental health and even how they they do their activism. So one thing I would love it if you can take into account is that decentralizing leadership is a difficult process. I know it takes a lot, especially in contexts like ours, to embolden people to speak up. But it's not as difficult as it seems once you start doing it. And in Setting Rivers, we're going through that process. I think it's very important also to understand that when you focus everything on one leader, you stop appreciating the strategy behind the movement. And that is, I think, a big problem with both Gandhi and Martin Luther King. A lot of people remember how great their speeches were, but they forget that they were also brilliant strategic minds. And that's what made their movements great, not their speeches, their strategy. So invest as much as you can on learning strategy, on your team members' learning strategy, and then the speaking, the public talks, the interviews, that is a plus, but it's a mean to an end. So make sure that the movement learns that and do decentralized leadership. Even in countries like mine where the political culture is very focused on faces and people, and I think that applies to all of Latin America, it's still not a good idea to have just one face to the movement.
This is an amazing answer. And in other words, however leaderless you want your movement to appear, it still needs to be led. The movements are living organisms and large groups of people. So what you need to have is a backbone. And as Janice said, you need a vision, you need a strategic plan, and you need to make everybody and their mothers aware of their role in the plan, and you need everybody and even your last activist on the front line or in a neighborhood to know who is doing what, when, how, and why. And a lot of the Canvas workshop and a lot of the Canvas materials that I will strongly encourage you to check out on our website, they're all free, are talking about the importance of having strategy, but also the importance of communicating this strategy through this large living creature you call movement. I'm going to answer a few questions myself. I saved the best for last. The one is talking about, like, the question was the role of rock and roll in movements and role of music in movements, and what may be the counterpart of this in the places like Sudan and Zim. And you caught me off guard. I don't have a clue what people in Sudan are listening to it, but what I know is that the music is very often a strong component of what we call movements identity. This question leads me to discuss a little bit about this big difference between the protest and the movement. Protest is a group of people with a grievance or demand. They do one of the tactics. It can be concentration, it can be dispersion, whatever, but it's about one thing. Movements are, however, the groups of people that have shared vision and strategy and are unified in the campaigns and communicating regularly, but they also share something we call movement identity. So that means if you're a member of an environmental movement, to start with a non-political one, that means you will turn your lights off, you will turn your screen off, you will recycle your garbage, you will have a certain behavior that shows that you're belonging to the movement. And that behavior doesn't necessarily needs to be how you politically express during the protest. It's something you do in your everyday life. Music and visuals and logos and symbols are also very powerful elements of movement identity, because people can physically brand themselves, but they can also identify with the music. So of course, for each culture, and this comes to the culture specification, various things works. So of course, it was the historic folk music and national songs that were sang when the Estonia was doing their singing revolution. And I mean, I've listened to these songs. I must say that I'm not a big fan, but it really, when you see people singing these songs, you see that the magic is working. So rock was that for a Serbian popular movement. And you can also see the effect that the certain groups of people well organized around the music can have on things like political conventions in the United States. And you can see what the K-pop fans have been doing on TikTok recently to mobilize around the politics and around the Black Lives Matter and all this kind of stuff. You can see the new tactics emerging. You can see YouTubers fundraising for the causes of the movements through people watching their videos and then using this money to fund the movement. So yes, I'm a little bit analog rock and roll era guy. And yes, the music can change and I'm not following it. And maybe it all sounds like a noise to my ears. K-pop definitely sounds like the boys band from 80s and 90s, but it has a strong importance because it's a part of the movement identity. So if you want to see if it's just the protest or the movement, watch for these signs, watch for signals, watch for logos, watch whether they share music, watch whether they share behavior, or they just share anger because of XYZ and they're there and they will burn the shop or the government building and then they will go back home or get arrested. Last question that I'm going to address, I tried to answer some in the chat, is the question about the food. And we were witnessing many cases in which, like I wrote a half of the chapter in the book about the Israeli cottage cheese and how it sparked the protests in Israel. We also know about the Maldivian rice pudding. The subtitle of my book has a rice pudding. Rice pudding was the way to gather people in the time of banning of the political gatherings in a pro-democracy struggle in the Maldives. There is also salt. We all remember Salt March in India. It was bread in Sudan. So why food is such an important thing? Because it affects everybody. Movements tend to grow exponentially when the issue becomes personal. Once again, movements tend to grow exponentially when it moves from political or ideological into the personal arena. When you take a look at the Serbian movement, you can see the two births of the movement, 96, 97, and then in 2000, both times after elections were stolen. Going on the elections is a political topic. Winning elections is a political topic. Stealing elections is like stealing your wallet. So everybody gets pissed off. So this is where we are looking into this emerging momentum, which can be about the food, it can be about stealing your vote, it can very often be about the corruption. Corruption tends to energize and incentivize people very much because people feel it as a personal injustice. So the clever movements know what is going to happen. We knew that Milosevic will steal the elections if he loses it. So we were planning for this moment where we're going to have this exponential growth. We're building the organization, we're preparing the tactics, we are building the local offices. We knew there will be a large influx of members, and then you need to do something with these people. You need to give them a clear plan, you need to give them the clear tasks, they expect some kind of organizations, otherwise you will miss your window of opportunity. So yes, the food is important, and yes, the music is important, and yes, you will need to look at how these movements gain traction, but making things personal is what you want to do if you want to build a successful movement. So 5:30 in Serbia, 11:30 somewhere else, probably a lot of different time zones. I would first of all like to thank you all that you were going on this journey with us. I hope it wasn't too boring and there were not too many technical hiccups. I would like to say how grateful I am and how proud I am to know Kumbu and Rania and Janice, the wonderful human beings and inspiring activists that have done things that I would never dare to do when I was in their age. I would also like to say how grateful I am for Canvas team, Breza, Anna, and to Jelenas, to making this thing possible together with our lovely interns. Hope you love these things. We will share the PowerPoint. We can also share the video. And this is where I'm going to say, welcome to Friday, same time, 9 a.m., 10 a.m. on the American East Coast, 4 a.m. here where I am in the Central European zone. We'll talk about the COVID activism. If you're interested in more stuff, please visit www.canvasopedia.org. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. You can also follow Kumbu and Rania and Janice. You can learn so much from them. And just make sure that if you have a problem and you think we have a solution, you contact us. Thank you for your time. It was both pleasure and honor to host this session.